Does confronting or facing a monster make the victim a monster, or does it say more about how the experience of surviving a monster was more of a defeat rather than a victory in itself? Although this film is very much a part of the 40-year-old Halloween franchise, it actively dispels the many sequels that followed the 1978 horror classic. Doing this allows it to function as a more appropriate and frankly superior sequel. Upon first seeing this film, I didn't think much of it outside of the fact that it was a great sequel and an entertaining spectacle that proved just how much the horror genre is making a comeback. However, upon rewatching David Gordon Green's Halloween 2018, I felt that there was deeper elements within the film which several criticisms alluded to in the disappointment that was felt, which came as a result of it being advertised purely as a revenge film when the central narrative had much more to say about the story and the ideas it was truly exploring, outside of Jamie Lee Curtis being a badass. There can be no denying that the idea was what attracted audiences into seeing Halloween 2018, especially when it came marketed as the kind of revenge story that can make any sequel that much more enticing. However, I think that the element of the story was most misleading, and a lot more than what people realized. Now, there can be no denying that Jamie Lee Curtis's Laurie Strode was focused on seeking revenge against Michael Myers, who, shortly after surviving the fall, which had resulted from Dr. Loomis shooting him, he was immediately apprehended and sentenced to the same mental hospital of which he had originally escaped from. However, in watching the film, you immediately realize that as revenge-centered as Laurie Strode's character arc is within Halloween 2018, that isn't her. The film isn't her story necessarily, at least not as much as we would have liked it to be. In fact, to say that the narrative focuses on one particular character alone would be rather obtuse. The three female leads of this film, Laurie, Karen, and Allison Nelson, who are Laurie's daughter and granddaughter, both have their own character arcs within the film, which are approached in a rather subtle fashion, given that although they are given less focus in comparison to that of Laurie, they do undergo a significant amount of character development. And this could easily be overlooked, especially if we didn't look to a character such as Laurie Strode and how much dramatic change or drastic change has occurred to her following her encounter with Michael Myers 4 years prior to the events within the story. Whether we watch the trailers, interviews, or the overall film itself, there is no secret that the events from 40 years prior had significantly impacted Laurie Strode and left her traumatized in a way which grants the film a level of analysis I felt was left unchecked. This is conveyed through the somewhat focused but still forgivable exposition given by two investigative journalists as they label themselves following a visit to the mental institution where Myers is residing and has very much remained since the 1978 encounter. The first 5 minutes of Halloween 2018, although not soul-wrenching, are terrifyingly effective enough in further conveying the very nature behind that of Michael Myers and why he is so effective as to what clearly is a force-of-nature villain of the horror genre. Now, this is not a new term, but for those who are still unfamiliar with the term force-of-nature villain, even though there have been enough Dark Knight analysis videos that have illustrated and made more well-known, I'll give you an update. Villains Wiki defined force-of-nature villains as being akin to unknown forces or higher powers rather than individuals. Force-of-nature villains are often supreme beings that embody the raw essence of primordial powers, which can very much be assigned to a character like Michael Myers, who Dr. Samuel Loomis studied and conclusively analyzed to determine that he was simply pure evil and nothing more. Although that may come off as a simplistic description, there is an element of introspection that this Halloween film tends to utilize when having Dr. Sartain play beyond the idea of him being the new Loomis, as Laurie Strode remarks when first meeting him. Within the opening of the film, we are given a standard level of exposition from Sartain concerning his relationship with Michael and how he was a student of Loomis up until his passing, and then him taking over Michael's case, which he has obsessed over for many years. Now, Halloween 2018 analyzes Michael Myers in a way where it certainly poses the question of what he is, and it uses Dr. Sartain as somewhat of a mouthpiece and scapegoat, even though he is an active participant as well. By that I mean he's very much like Laurie Strode. He, along with several other characters, undergoes a significant and impactful change which can be attributed to Michael Myers' existence. Following my first viewing of Halloween 2018, I read an analysis by Newsweek that was titled Halloween 2018 Ending, Is Michael Myers Even After Laurie Strode? It's a bizarre and even more out-of-the-box question in comparison to the more standardly used one that reverts to the ambiguity of whether or not Michael Myers is in fact alive, which by now, anyone who has seen Halloween 2018 and stuck around long to wait after the credits can fully grasp that he is most likely alive and ready to reap out more of the random chaos and murder many characters in the film often attributed to in a more predestined motive. One of the theories that Dr. Sartain poses within the film entails the possibility that the very thing that has kept both Laurie and Michael alive for so many years has been their insatiable need for a reunion. He postulates that Laurie's drive for revenge is what has made her stronger, as opposed to what a more standard idea of a victim would result in following a traumatic experience such as the one she nearly suffered from when Michael Myers went after her. In Michael's case, he theorizes that he has an instinctive drive to kill, which only propels him into further wanting to know and understand what lies at the core of his very being. I'll admit that I haven't seen any of the other Halloween films outside of the original and the sequel that I'm talking about right now, which spares no effort in saying fuck the other sequels and as well as the remakes. But I still admire this aspect of the film, which anybody who has already seen Halloween 2018 has noted is one of the weaker elements of the film in regards to the character shift of Dr. Sartain and the moment of madness he demonstrates when he kills a police officer who runs over Michael Myers and then simultaneously kidnaps Laurie's granddaughter as part of an attempt to unite Michael and Laurie in order to further satisfy the rather intellectual curiosity that the film uses and then redirects. I know. By now I sound like I'm making a whole lot of sense. In fact, for me to even kind of claim or any level of rationality at this point would itself sound like a massive shot in the dark. But that's how I usually operate. But regarding the Newsweek article and the central question of is Michael Myers even after Laurie Strode, I think that idea is what drives this Halloween sequel and how it examines Michael Myers and how he is shot out of the window the second we see Sartain plead with Michael to say something right before dying as a result of a face stomp, which is as equally gross as a pumpkin head being crushed. I know, quite a gross way of describing it, but again, the moment where he pleads Michael to speak only illustrates the lack of understanding of the deep mystery I'm certain the other Halloween films have attempted to explore over the years, because there is certainly no denying that as a force-of-nature villain, Michael Myers prompts a significant amount of curiosity concerning his motives as well as his drive for murder, if there is any drive whatsoever. I put a big, if not a massive emphasis on that last part because my personal thoughts are that instead of exploring the nature of Michael Myers, the film decides to use the obsessive nature of Sartain and what his desire to analyze and understand what was truly inside this patient as a major fuck you to any ideas we had of receiving a satisfactory answer. Now, it doesn't end there, because then the question of what drove Michael Myers would just have been as an empty story element. There is certainly no denying that there is a great level of mystery with Myers and the force of nature he represents. And in an interview with the actress Andi Matichak remarked on how she always felt that Michael Myers was more like a shark, essentially detailing further how there was essentially no rhyme or reason behind his drive for killing. And I found that part fascinating, because even though that question is postulated and not taken any further, its initial dismissal poses an even greater question. No, but I say pose, yeah. It poses an even greater question that the Newsweek article I have put a link down below illustrates by detailing the effect Michael Myers has on people, and many characters within the film exemplifying this theme. I mean, starting with Laurie, which is the most obvious, given how much the night from 40 years ago had affected her so much that she adopted a very predatory and survivalist mentality, that although it made her a stronger person, it practically impacted her relationships with that of her daughter and granddaughter to the extent where either they kept their distance or carried a sense of or a sense of resentment regarding the psychological trauma her own suffering had placed upon them. In promoting the film, Jamie Lee Curtis spoke about how this film is essentially about a person suffering from trauma. I think that declaration alone shows that any assumption about Halloween 2018 being that of a revenge film, or purely a revenge film, should be thrown out the window, given that the film does a moderate job of capturing the effect Michael Myers has on the characters within the film. Now stated and made clear within the character of Laurie, this film has already gone out of its way to depict her as a psychologically tormented person who, following her experience and survival with Michael Myers, wound up adopting a more predatory approach in combating what she felt was an evil she was destined or praying would escape. The trailer for Halloween 2018 held no expense in showing this detail, as it certainly wished to capture the inherent feeling of intensity many audience members would undoubtedly feel in the build-up of what was to be a great horror film around the time of the Halloween holiday. At the same time, though, I feel this element is crucial because it further explores the depths of Laurie Strode's psychosis and how fundamentally ruptured it had become as a result of the trauma she suffered in surviving the encounter with a force of nature like Michael Myers, that she was willing to take the potential risk of a monster like him being let loose out into the public just so she could eliminate him. Now, when going to Sartain, discussing the nature and thematic conception of a character like Michael Myers, I think it is important to take into account that aside from the audience, many of the characters in and even outside the film Halloween 2018 seem to understand the fact that Michael Myers is not necessarily a person when he fits more into the force of nature aspects popular culture has placed him in. The fact that he is regarded as the shape, even in the film scripts of Halloween and Halloween 2018, further strengthens this point of how hollow and empty he is, because essentially there is no rhyme or reason, love or hate within the kills he commits. He is just as pure evil as he can be. When I made that reference regarding characters at the side of the film, I was regarding Dr. Loomis, and all the time and research he did in working with Michael Myers, his inherent conclusion was that he was simply pure evil. This point is stressed by the character of Dr. Sartain, who mentioned early on that he was a pupil of Loomis, and after he had passed on, he had taken over his work, in which he openly admits had formulated this obsessive curiosity in which Michael triggered within him, and so much so that over the course of the film, he openly expresses his own theories about Michael and how he wonders what he must be essentially feeling in the moments that he does kill, or if his mind is so evolved that his reason for killing is so profoundly complex that it is undefinable by human standards. All these are potential, if not past-tread assumptions, scholars or film scholars, to be more precise, have most likely had regarding the character of Michael Myers and what possibly makes him tick. Now, the opening of the film does that in a slightly cheesy and somewhat hammy manner, where one of the investigative journalists says they like to regard themselves. Sorry, I couldn't help it. Anyway, in the opening of the film, as we are introduced to the haunting image of Michael's backside, one of the journalists pulls out Michael's mask, which he claims he got from a friend in the Eternity Journal's office. Now, as to whether this is true or if he just stole it, because it wouldn't be anything new for a journalist to steal a piece of evidence for a major crime. However, given that this little element isn't really touched on, it doesn't border on a level of ridiculous, so profound that although it isn't unforgivable, it still presents itself as a plot hole. Thankfully, it does serve the purpose of further exploring the more mythic nature of Michael Myers and the vaguely supernatural elements that paint his force of nature presence, because the moment the mask is revealed, he immediately feels its presence even when he isn't looking. I'm sorry about the little minor interruptions back there. I kind of lost my train of thought, but all the other patients within the yard are reacting in the most primal forms of aggression possible when it comes to the mask being shown, and in a way that further works to capture the predatory theme this film touches on that Sartain wishes to discover, but ultimately fails pitifully as he goes as far as to literally stabbing a police officer, played by Bill Paxton, and kidnapping Allison just for the sake of satisfying what is most certainly an intellectual curiosity the film is touching on and equally discarding, as a way of saying to audiences still trying to understand a character like Michael Myers and how that is essentially a pointless endeavor. I think it is presented both as a fuck you to the audience as well as to the arrogance of Sartain, whose final line before having his head crushed gross is say something, and with no surprise, Michael says nothing, which only leads us back to the idea of what effect an entity like Michael Myers has on other people. And this actually brings me back to one of the lesser discussed characters in the film, and that is Officer Hawkins. Officer Hawkins is played by Bill Paxton, and I think his performance as the officer is actually quite underrated in my opinion, and one of the things I felt was rather interesting about his character wasn't just simply his backstory so much as his behavior towards Michael Myers. When Officer Hawkins is first introduced, nothing is remotely special about it. In fact, the way he's presented as the old cop playing pinball at a local gas station isn't anything we haven't seen in cinema, especially in the horror genre. Even his backstory about him being the first police officer to apprehend Michael is nothing unique. What is new, though, is the small nickname of Burnout he is presented with. And along with the fact that when looking closer at his backstory and how and adding to being the first person on the scene the night Michael Myers killed all those people and how he essentially stopped Loomis from killing him, while comparing it to his present-day behavior to Michael only gives his character, or at least his place within the main intellectual ambiguity of the film, that much more significance. At first glance at the inherent and rather passionate hatred I saw Hawkins display in his desire to kill Michael, I honestly believe he had been the character of Sheriff Lee Brackett from the very first Halloween, who was the father of Annie Brackett, one of Laurie Strode's friends who Myers killed. When I realized the names were different and how much older the character would have been over a 40-year period, I immediately recognized he had been an entirely different character. At the same time, though, the significant detail that was placed into the backstory of the character and how he had stopped Loomis from killing Michael only further illustrates the undoubted amount of regret he must have been carrying in all those years. He is most certainly portrayed as a standard old-school cop in all those, and with enough street smart to make his contemporaries look less competent in comparison that a lot of films do play on this idea. However, I like that in Halloween 2018, it is never done in a way where it's overly flashy, and when it is used to further demonstrate the idea of what effect Myers can have on the diverse array of characters presented within the film. Hawkins is just another casualty in the tragedies Michael Myers creates for his existence, and will continue to create as he continues killing. And I think that's carried on with characters like Allison and Karen. Now, although Allison and Karen, Laurie's daughter and granddaughter's involvement within Michael Myers can be more attributed to the fact that the only gradual effect he had on them relates more for the influence of Laurie Strode's obsessive fixation for revenge, the film still does make an effort that their experience with Michael on the night of October 31st does indeed significantly change them. Starting with Karen, who is played by Judy Greer in her usually somewhat friendly Judy Greer fashion, which no doubt served as an attempt of adding more humor to the film. However, it wasn't solely for the purpose of humor, and I say thank God, because then it would have come off as a bit of an overused gimmick. Instead, this element of the film is used to add more depth to the character of Karen, who we learn early on was subjected to the obsessive fixation of her mother's desire to prepare her for the horrors of this world, as she told her granddaughter, which was her way of justifying her own behavior, even if it came off at the very expense of being hated by the same daughter. Now, there is a moment in the film where Karen gives a hefty explanation about her childhood and the trauma her mother's preparations did for her. That moment within the film certainly came off as more premeditated than natural, when I can forgive it, because it still makes the flip the character moment Judy Greer's character experiences near the end of the film more rewarding, and it was pretty badass how she pretty much gotcha'd Michael and shot him in the end, and I think this change is relevant because when looking at her character and how her central flaw revolved on her self-denial, her rejection of her mother, and even the extent of the length she would go to perpetuate her own denial, and not only literally pretending that Halloween didn't take place, where she literally wore an Xmas sweater, but at the same time went out of her way to make sure she tried to keep her daughter away from her own mother. Now, going to her daughter Allison, there is something to be said concerning the role as she has in inheriting her own grandmother's legacy, which I saw scattered throughout the course of the film, as well as in the final shot where the camera focuses on her hand holding onto the very knife Michael used throughout the film to commit many of his killings, which she herself used against him to save her mother. I think that saying the character of Allison is a Laurie Strode copycat has been an understatement. The film certainly positions Allison in a similar pattern to that of her grandmother, while at the same time even having her experience her fair share of high school drama to illustrate that she is being most certainly set up to be the very next Laurie Strode. However, at the same time, I would argue against the idea that she is a copycat of the character from the 1978 film, because that would just be a major misreading of her own character journey within the Halloween 2018 film, given that although the narrative is certainly saying enough about how much like her grandmother she is, destined to carry the mantle of violence and trauma that essentially defined much of her own mother's childhood. I know, quite a mouthful, but I say this by going back to the final scene of the film, where the camera focuses on Allison's grip on the knife, further encapsulating this point on how she will very much remain changed from the more innocent character that she was introduced in as the film, and she was basically your standard middle-class American honor student. I mean, thank God she wasn't a stereotype. However, in watching her progression throughout the film, as well as her exposure to the many horrific elements of the Halloween night, I feel she wouldn't most certainly been written off as just another bland character, which is something horror movies mistakenly do when centering the film around a young heroine, and it certainly excites me for what kind of expectations we can have for the two Halloween sequels. I mean, let me see the titles. Halloween Kills and Halloween Ends. I mean, strange titles, but at the same time, I am excited for them. But in giving my final thoughts on Halloween 2018, I don't believe it is a masterpiece, and I don't think I could ever have said that it was within the 1978 original. However, I think that there is something relevant about what I feel is great, if not a superior sequel to the 1978 original, and that is due to the fact that it not only paid great homage to the original, but at the same time, this sequel equally went out of its way to use many questions postulated throughout the franchise's way of building the format of a unique story, and at the same time dispelling some ideas that the film itself uses as a way of further adding more depth to the horrifying ambiguity that has painted the mythos of the franchise since we first saw the blank look on a 6-year-old Michael Myers just moments after he brutally stabbed his sister to death.